Welcome to CDR Berlin with Paul Randolph.
Thank you.
So I have Paul Randolph next to me, hailing over from Detroit. You've been on stage with a lot of people, with Roy Ayers, with Ben Harper, with P-Funk. The list goes on and on and on and on. How did that happen?
I was at the right place at the right time, as best I can really say, really honestly. Just kind of being at the right place at the right time.
Could you define one of those moments?
Oh, wow. I can define one moment in particular that led to People Make the World Go Round. I was at the studios, Submerged Studios in Detroit, and I went to go visit Mike Banks there.
Mike Banks of Underground Resistance?
Of Underground Resistance, who he and I grew up together, and we played in bands together and all kinds of stuff. And he was really trying to get me involved in the whole Detroit electronic scene. He was really my introduction to it. And one day he invited me over, and he was working on Jaguar at that time. And he was playing me the beginning pieces of that. He happened to mention Carl Craig's name.
You have heard of him before?
I had not heard of him before. I was really pretty much ignorant to, I mean, I knew who Derek May was, but outside of that, I was really
What time was
unfamiliar. Early 90s, maybe, late 80s, early 90s. You know, mentioned that Carl was coming to the studio, and we were kind of playing instruments and whatnot, and Carl walked in, and that was my introduction to Carl, and then that led several years later to us working on the Inner Zone Orchestra record. And then that relationship led to others, working with Kevin Saunderson and the rest of the Detroit royalty.
The whole gang?
Yeah, the whole gang.
Okay. So did you ever have the feeling that you were part of that whole gang? Kevin Saunderson, Derek May, those names from back then?
I was kind of an underling, it felt like, in the beginning, which made total sense because I knew that the music was there, but outside of Mike, I really didn't have any access to it. So once I kind of got in the circle, it became more accessible to me. And then we did a few songs. I did my first house track under a different name called, I called myself Van Ryn at the time. And it was this really crazy, sounded more like Sylvester than anything, Sylvester with a really raspy cough. But, and that was really my first, like house electronic record. And then came Carl, and then
But you started with instruments first, right?
Yes, I started studying music when I was 6 years old in São Paulo, Brazil.
How did you get there?
My father worked for Philco Ford at the time. Actually, we were studying with the same teacher.
Your father and yourself studied with the same music teacher? Or?
Same guitar teacher. I started off as a guitarist, and then that led to percussion, and that led to drums, and then eventually I found my way to playing bass, and I kind of stayed there. And I was happy just playing bass, actually. I had no intention of singing, but that's funny how necessity sometimes is the mother of invention. And
I actually have to explain maybe how we both met. I mean, that was a really, really long time ago, and at that time I think you were playing in Berlin with Amp Fiddler, who is a musician from Detroit as well, and Paul was playing bass, and then I was DJing at the after-show party with Alex from JAZZANOVA, funny enough. Amp was just freestyling, doing some live singing, and then he went off stage. All of a sudden there was this guy on stage and singing even better than Amp Fiddler, and we thought, who is this guy? And then we figured out, yeah, it's Paul Randolph, and that's the first time we met. That was probably almost 10 years ago.
Exactly.
And so ever since, your music has been heard quite a lot. So you started as a stage musician, or how did you get in touch with all those musicians that I named before? Were you mostly playing bass for them on stage, or how did you encounter?
Well, you know, Detroit is a music capital, as you know, but it's a small town, just like any town, and so everybody kind of knows of each other, or 6 degrees of separation or something to that effect. So Amp and I knew each other for years, but we never really had an opportunity to play together. And then, of course, I mentioned I played with Mad Mike earlier on. My history was pretty much in bands and playing predominantly as a sideman. And then it wasn't until later that I started to sing. And that was really because I had a 7-piece R&B band with horns and everything, and one New Year's Eve I decided that I had a lot of trouble finding singers, and ones with temperament and punctuality. And
is that very common among singers?
I'm not going to say that, but anybody can be, I guess, a pain in the ass when they want to be, but it just got to the place where I said, I think I have to try this myself. And I did, much to the shock of my band.
And the shock of yourself?
Yeah.
Where did this come from all of a sudden?
Well, I was singing background. I just wasn't accustomed to singing all night long. It was jumping into the water, like, head first, and I had no choice. Well, actually, I called a friend of mine who was a really good singer, and I said, I just did the craziest thing ever, and I fired my singer. We have gigs starting next week, and my whole band is mad at me, and I got to do this. He said, you'll be fine, and gave me a cassette tape of the vocal improvement, like vocal exercises. He said, do this every day, and you'll be fine. And I did it every day, and I'd go in and do, so it was just like practical application. And only to find out that I actually had a range, and I could actually do it. So that led to other things.
That was still at the time where were doing music as a hobby, right? That wasn't where you were doing it professionally, or?
I was in college and playing at night. So I mean, I really knew that I wanted to do it full time, but to please my folks, and to also do a logical thing, which was have something to fall back onto. I, finished my degree.
But that was in marketing, right?
Yes. And I ended up using all those skills for music anyway, so it worked out. It was not a waste of time and money.
Now you're working with JAZZANOVA a lot in their live band?
Yes.
You were already part of their album, so I guess we can ask them later how that came about. But how is it now working with a band touring full time, and being the stage man of JAZZANOVA?
Well, it's fun because for me it's a bit of a different dimension. I'm usually accustomed to having a third appendage, which is my instrument. Sometimes it's a bit scary not having, I think every performer kind of has their security blanket. Some people it's glasses or a hat or a scarf or something that they can feel that makes them feel comfortable. My instrument was what made me feel comfortable, and suddenly I was like, okay, I play a couple of times and now I'm just singing. So it took some time to get used to it, just trying to figure out what to do with your hands. It's like getting up and speaking for the first time in front of people, and you do that classic, or you just don't know what to do with your hands, or you're just trying to figure out.
So you also have to learn how to entertain? Well,
entertain without my instrument in my hand. All this time it had been having this. So, but, I learned fast, and you just kind of watch, you watch the videos and you go, oh God, that didn't work. Or, oh, that did work. Okay, I'll do that again. Oh no, don't do that again. So, yes.
So are there certain tricks when you're standing in front of a crowd and everybody's just looking at you strangely, and you're standing there and have to perform, and then is there like a key thing that you do to loosen people up?
I have a habit of not looking out in the audience for at least half of the show, because I think I know.
Is that why you wear sunglasses?
That's a big reason why I wear sunglasses, is to concentrate. Because it's a lot of information to take in. You're not only doing your thing, but you're also interacting with the musicians. You have to be inside of the music and outside of the music and all at the same time. So there has to be some kind of focus there. You know, there's an art to entertaining. I still do, I watch famous entertainers and what they do, what makes them really great. And the one thing they all seem to have in common is they're very inviting. They welcome you into that space instead of you feeling like you're a part of their space. You know, you should be glad that you're a part of my space. Making them feel like, I need you to do this. In order for me to do this, I need you as well. Now, different people have different ways of doing that, you know, obviously. Some people can stand perfectly still, you know, the late, great Luther Vandross. Luther didn't dance and sing, he just sang, you know, and he stood there and he sang his ass off. But he had such a presence, you know. Then you look at people like David Bowie, who have a theater background, so they understand how to use a stage, but they're also very inviting. So I just carefully watch different people and watch what they do and what I think I can do, what makes sense for me to do. I mean,
but for the musicians, I mean, they all play their little parts, but you are basically, as a frontman, the one showing the emotions. So you really have to, I mean, correct me, you're the one actually singing the lyrics. You're eventually the one coming up with the lyrics also. How does that work when people tell you, okay, I want to collaborate with you, I want you to sing on my record, and they give you a tune? You're the one basically who has to deliver the emotions to the tune.
Right.
Do you see it that way?
Every now and again, you'll work with people, and I mean this in all honesty, like with JAZZANOVA, when I did the first song with them, Let Me Show You, it was probably one of the first tracks that I had been given that was almost a complete idea. It was, even if it was in a work in process form, there was definitive parts. There were, you know, and they were very obvious, you know. Sometimes I don't get that. Sometimes I'll get something that's very, very stripped down and very minimal, and then they go back and they develop a song around it. Now, sometimes that works out okay, and sometimes it works out horribly, because the vocals end up sounding like an afterthought instead of a part of the music. Instead of me being a part of what's going on, I end up sounding like a sample.
Is it, most of the time, do you get the music via file through the internet, or do you actually sit in the studio and then work on music?
Most of the time, I work from a file. Which in itself I think is amazing. I mean, you know, when I think of, you know, technology in that way, you know, that we can share, I can work with anybody in the world and just swap files out. I think that's amazing. Okay, yeah, some people would love for you to be there, but listen, I mean, we all have a limited budget that we're working with. Nobody's gonna send me a plane ticket to fly to South Africa to stay for a week to do one song, which leads me to say, I ask a lot of questions. I try to make sure I understand what their expectations are and what they want from me. I mean, what do you want me to do? Depending on the language barrier, sometimes it takes a little while for people to understand what I mean when I ask some very specific questions. And, you know, my favorite is when people say, oh, just sing soulful. But what does that mean to you? You know, what does that mean? Give me an example. You know,
so does it help when they say, oh, just do it similar to this tune, I really like this? Or would you rather say, but this is not really challenging me as an artist?
I would rather you give me examples and say, this is what I kind of where I'm thinking, but I want you to do what you do. But here, you know, this gives you an idea of where my head is at. And so then I'm not, you know, working at a feverish pace, and then I get, you know, I send it to them and I'm all excited about what I've done, and it's like, oh, I'm sorry, but this is not what I had in mind. But I asked you what you had in mind, and you said, just do your thing. So that would be something I would recommend to anybody that's producing music and working with singers, and even musicians for that matter. The more information you can give people, the better. Even if it's sketchy to you, even if it seems like you're being very indecisive, you're not being indecisive, you're giving examples. And the more examples, if you can't really speak in musical terms, then just kind of, you know, draw stickmen I mean, just create the picture somehow, and for the person, give musical examples or whatever it takes.
If there's somebody in the audience who says, "I always wanted to work with Paul Randolph," what would be the kind of music that catches your attention?
I am not just a house and electronic musician, singer. I really love experimental stuff. I really love anything that's innovative and different. I'm really, a lot of people are, a little apprehensive to send me stuff because they think maybe it's a little too weird. Oh, please do. Because chances are that's really what I'll be attracted to, something that's a little bit different and off the cuff. Yeah, the weirder the better. Yeah. Different instrumentation, the whole 9 yards. Harder, faster, I don't know.
Do you have any inspiration, and do you like things like Sun Ra? Have you listened to his music or watched some of his performance? I'm asking that because it's inspired me a lot in the way of creating and listening music in a new way of performance.
Sure. I mean, I'm very familiar with Sun Ra, and as a matter of fact, I was watching on YouTube, they had a movie. I didn't realize he had made that movie. And it was incredible. Movies,
but it's a lot of long performance and interviews. I'm just spending so much time doing it.
It was
very
great.
Interesting.
I'm convinced that Stargate was based off of that movie because it was very much alike. I mean, just what he was talking about, was really amazing. But yeah, I mean, I was very lucky. I had a lot of influences. There was lots of music around me when I was growing up. My parents were extremely eclectic. My grandmother had Rolling Stones records. I mean, I had everything. So there was a nice palette. So naturally, when I was old enough to kind of start reading magazines and, kind of...
Yeah, apart from getting your thing down musically, what kind of advice could you offer in terms of getting the ball rolling on the business side? And I know it's hard to advise, being in the right place at the right time, but in terms of making yourself available to opportunity, but not, taking crappy gigs that you shouldn't be taking, kind of thing.
I think the best thing you can do is make your wish list, what you want to do, and be as outrageous as you possibly can. Because I think once you realize that it's more accessible than you think it is, then you just have to deal with how am I going to get to that person, or get to that place. I think you have to really just know what you want, first of all. And then you can kind of avoid a lot of the crap that you can kind of avoid all the people in between. And that's what I did.
Not when you have to pay the rent, though.
Indeed you do. Oh, you're talking about full-time, if you're a full-time person? Oh, well, then that's a different philosophy altogether. I mean, you're going to have to figure out what you're willing to do as your meat and potatoes as a temporary thing. Because you always have to think of it as temporary. You know what I'm saying? Because you might have a really great gig that's, you play 5 times a week and it pays your rent and it feeds you. And you might think, well, this isn't, I mean, it's paying my rent, but I'm not really doing what I want to do. Just remember that that's a decision that you have to make. I mean, while that business is taken care of, you have to be working on your other thing. So when that opportunity comes, you can jump. Because ultimately you're going to have something in your hand that's tangible. You can't just walk up to people and say, well, I do this. You have to say, this is who I am. So, I mean, I always encourage people to just absolutely know what you want to do and just know that whatever you have to do temporarily to take care of yourself, just do it. Because time will take care of everything else.
Nice.
Yeah.
How do you deal with artistic or financial crisis? I know that was already a little part of it, but when you're at home, you got a tape, you want to work on something, and there's just no idea coming to your head. Does that ever happen?
Sure, but it's funny. I was talking to someone about this recently. For me personally, those are the times when I kind of shut down and just observe and listen, because to me it's kind of like a waterfall. Sometimes it's just endless, and then sometimes there's a dam up the stream, and the waterfall becomes a trickle. But then the dam breaks and it becomes a waterfall again. To me, those are your most creative times because you're absorbing and you're living life so that you have something to talk about in your music. When you finally get to that place where, okay, the lights go back on again, and I feel inspired to do this.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.